This is Sajit, and I'm going to toss it over to her to introduce herself for this talk.
Thanks. So I was thinking, a little bit about it before we started talking. And to me, one of the interesting things about my journey with astrology is that I actually came to astrology as a total skeptic. I was not like a totally woo-woo person or deep into metaphysics. I actually came from a very scientific-oriented background and education. I got my BA in ecology and animal behavior, and then my master's degree is in dance movement therapy, which is a form of psychotherapy. And so psychologically oriented. And the way I got into astrology is that I got into a relationship with a man who'd been an astrologer for 25 years. And he would tell me things about my chart and what was coming up for me. And I was totally skeptical. And so it took me about 2 years of I'd listened to the things he said about my astrology, and I took it with a lot of grains of salt. And after 2 years of kind of listening and then watching and seeing, was it accurate? And it was so accurate. And I had, clients, psychotherapy clients, and I was like, wow, astrology provides so much more information that I can't really access by just talking, to my clients. And so my motivation for learning astrology, studying it, and being able to be a professional astrologer is that I want to be able to help my clients more than I was able to help them just with psychotherapy. So I just wasn't automatically, I just didn't swallow the whole thing whole, the whole astrology thing. I was very, very skeptical, and it kind of had to prove itself to me before I was willing to really take it seriously. And now that I've been a professional astrologer since 2003, I can't do the math. Well, what is that? Almost 20 years.
20 years, yeah.
Yeah. And then before that, many years of being a psychotherapist. So after all of these years of practicing professional astrology, it's proven itself to me again and again and again, because I know things about people. If I have their birth information, I know a huge amount of information about them that I'd have no way of knowing if I didn't have the astrology tool. So the kind of astrology I do is a special kind called evolutionary astrology. And that means that I'm totally fascinated by the soul's journey of evolution from lifetime to lifetime. And it doesn't mean that people need to know about their past lives. What it means is that I can see what are the themes of your past lives or, anyone's past lives. And why that's relevant to the current lifetime is that the past life themes that are most relevant to this lifetime is what I see in the chart. And it shows me what are your major soul lessons that you're here to work through? What are you here to heal and resolve in this lifetime so that you can move forward with your evolution on a soul level?
A few questions already.
Yeah.
So that past life inclination or predisposition, is that a South Node reference? Is that what you're looking to get that?
Yes, I work a lot with the nodes. So evolutionary astrology works a lot with the nodes. And then I don't want to get so deep into astrology that people are lost, but I'll just share a few things about in terms of the South Node and past lives. So I start gathering information about past lives and the soul lessons from the South Node. And then I also would look at what's the planet that guides the sign of the South Node. So my South Node's in the sign of Taurus. Well, Venus is the planet that guides the sign of Taurus. So I would start with the sign that South Node is in. Then I'd look at the planet that guides that sign. And then I also look at, what are the other aspects going on? What other planets are in a certain geometric relationship with the South Node, with the planet that guides the South Node? I also look at what house the South Node is in. So the South Node is a really good starting point. And then it kind of branches out from there. And you get more and more and more information.
I think it's interesting, although it can be kind of lost in the nomenclature of astrology at times. But I think it's interesting if you often will hear past life or something to this effect, which seems like a big philosophical leap to anybody. So I think providing it like, here's some context, here's like here's where the tradition can point to that. I think that's very important, as opposed to this, like, here's this blanket statement, just take that.
Yeah. And the way I always work with people is that I'll share the themes that I'm seeing based on their chart. And then I always am it's very important that I hear back from that person how they resonate with that information. If they hear that and they say like, well, I don't relate to those themes at all, then there's usually something wrong with the picture in terms of maybe they gave you the wrong birth time or something, because usually the information I receive through the chart is very, very accurate in terms of these themes. So I would never tell someone like as an authority on, I'm not the authority on anybody. Everyone's always the authority on themselves.
Yeah. I run into the same thing when I was being a tarot reader for some years. And so it's about setting context properly, and presence is a big thing. But anyhow, I wanted to, so this soul coaching, or this coaching style, just to summarize, seems like the kind of juxtaposition of psychotherapy and astrology, right? Of course, with whatever seeming marrying disciplines that you can kind of throw into it. So it seems to be quite the eclectic enterprise. So in which case, are there any other notable disciplines that seem to have joined in? Like, for instance, maybe like you did mention your degree in
the dance movement therapy.
Yes.
Yeah. So I love that question, because yes, I do bring in, or I do connect and integrate the movement or the body, the somatic experience with astrology. And the way that I link those two things is that the energies that are talked about in astrology are often referred to as archetypes.
Jungian.
Yeah.
That's a Jung reference.
Those archetypal energies can be experienced in the body. They can be experienced somatically. And to me, that's the most powerful way. So it's not just some intellectual, airy-fairy idea. It's like, okay, how do I live this energy? How do I feel this? How do I work with this in my physical body? So again, if I'll use the example of Taurus, the sign of Taurus relates to the physical body. And so if someone has a lot of Taurus energy in their chart, it's going to be very helpful for them to be connected to their body and connected to nature, and really understand that the way they perceive things is a lot kinesthetically, maybe more so than in words. So to bring it into the body, I think, can be really helpful and really powerful.
And that immediately takes my mind to channeling or skinwalking or shape-shifting of like the more animistic cultures, right? Where if we want something, then we embody that archetype, right? We take in that spirit per se, or if we want to translate it, playing a part. What they call that? When actors like convince themselves of their roles and,
method
acting, basically. Yes. So just play the part as if, right? And so we can call it archetype, spirit, characteristic, the healing attributes of being open to embodying a different way of being, which is interesting, I think. I also thought that in that eclectic conjunction, it's very true with even if somebody wants to get into astrology alone, that oftentimes it will just, it's like it's an open field in the sense that it can so easily lead to tarot, or it can so easily lead to, say, the I Ching or runes or any of these subjects. So I think it's interesting to see that, you kind of seemingly took that reverse approach where, and then used it to complement what you were already doing. Because in a weird way, your position, that position in society is to, for one, provide comfort, be a comforting presence to people, providing vulnerability. But also you need to be able to reach them in their mind or their soul, right? And so then you have to be able to understand and to be able to accommodate whatever energy you're facing.
Yes.
Of course, astrology is a perfect ancient tool that's been beautifully crafted. Anyhow, so I have some of the questions that were posed from some of the listeners here. And I think we can start with one of the most contentious. It's almost like a meme in the sense of, I've heard this question so many times about astrology, and it is the Vedic versus the tropical, or the sidereal versus the Western calculation. And as I've seen it bounce back and forth, it's just two different ways of calculating, and one doesn't disrespect the other. And that seemingly, as I've talked to people who have spent a lot more time in it, it would be that you can entertain both without it being
a conflict.
Yeah. So have you bumped into this? What's your experience? What nuance could you bring to this conversation?
It is very kind of sort of a common question that comes up, especially nowadays that in our Western culture, so many people are into yoga, and then from yoga, it can lead them into the Vedic approach to astrology. So the kind of astrology I do, the evolutionary astrology, is a form of Western astrology. And I have not studied Vedic astrology. I do have a dear friend who professionally practices both kinds of astrology. So I've really learned from him to appreciate that they're both valid, that they both can be very helpful. And it's kind of like having two different sets of glasses. Okay, are you going to look through this pair of glasses, or those, these lenses or those lenses? And it's not that one lens is wrong and the other one is right. So because I haven't studied Vedic astrology, I can't speak a lot to that. One thing I have heard is that Vedic astrology is really good at things like setting dates for things, like what's the best date to get married or to break ground on building your house, that kind of forecasting, the best energies, the best time for particular things. So I think it is really good for the timing, choosing the timing of things. Other than that, I can't really speak a lot to like what are the strengths of one as compared to the other, but they each have their strengths. And one of the things, and again, maybe you can let me know if this is kind of going too deep into the astrology, is that in Western astrology, the first sign of the zodiac is Aries. And Aries is at the spring equinox, which is the beginning of the spring season. So even though in our sky right now, so Vedic astrology is based on where are the planets actually in the sky right now, whereas Western astrology is kind of based on where things were in the sky, I don't know how many thousands of years ago, because of the precession of the equinoxes. Things have changed. So, however, it's a little bit, I feel like it's a little hard to describe, and you can decide if this is going too deep. But what I'm trying to get at is that even though if on the spring equinox, you're standing somewhere on the earth and looking up into the sky, the sun might not be actually moving into the sign of Aries like it would have 1,000 or I don't know how many years ago it actually was aligned with the sign of Aries on the day of the spring equinox. But if you think of it in terms of the archetypal energy of Aries, Aries is the energy of new beginnings. It's that spark of fire that gets things started. And you can think that's like what gets the seeds to burst open in the springtime so the plants can start to grow. It is the energy of a new beginning, of an initiation, of getting things moving, getting things going, or getting things growing. That's true about the archetype of Aries. So to me, it's still relevant to think of that archetype of Aries, even though there's been the precession of the equinoxes.
So, I'm trying to hedge myself from going in head first, because this is really mind-dissolving territory. And what I mean by that is this seems mostly like a question of where. And the actual mechanics of, say the astral bodies have an influence on the macro and the micro, right? Both the interpersonal and the political aspects of what happens on Earth. So then comes this giant question: how? And not how in the sense of like why, or like that's woo woo or whatever, not dismissively, but like there is no how, in the sense of, are we talking about strings of quanta that are entangled from the greater firmaments? Are we talking about like influences through ether that substantiate the foundations of what is possible here? Are we talking about, yada yada yada, right? And so I find it interesting to like assert, where do we prioritize this influence? Say there is an influence, right? Say hard fast influence. Where is it coming from? And is where the proper question? Is it coming from that constellation? Is it coming like, and how so? Or is it always present here and we are just kind of projecting it outward to influences above? I don't know. Have you mused about that, or am I just...
Yes, I've definitely mused about it, and I haven't come to any kind of, solid ground. I don't think there is any solid ground. And I know that there's different theories, like that there's actual, like say that a planet is actually an entity, and that entity sends out its influence. I just don't know. I really don't know the how, and I don't take a lot of time trying to understand the how or figure it out, because I don't know that it even is figure outable. All I know is that when I use this tool and the way I use it, and this is Western astrology that I use, I just know how incredibly accurate and powerful it is. And it's like, it's functional. I know how to use it in a functional way. I know how to apply it. And that's what matters to me.
I do. Yes. And there's a lot of power to that. That's where it's genuinely at. I get a little bit incorrigible as to the unbeknownst. The only other, I won't spend any more time on this, but just while it's on my head, the only other thing that I like to throw in that I was trying to wrap my head around when I was introduced to it around 17. It wasn't in the Midwest. It was not during that time, was not talked about. There was nothing about that whatsoever. And then it got introduced to me by one character. And as I moved west years later, I realized how much more ubiquitous the conversation is, not just geographically, but then also since then, the conversation is starting to move through the Midwest now. And so there's that whole conversation, which I think we should get on later. But what I was trying to wrap my head around when it was introduced to me is that if these planets are influencing this planet, then that would be to say that if we were on another planet, that the Earth itself represents an archetype externally, right? And also, if we existed in a different constellation, then this constellation would have an archetypal, right?
Yes.
Because otherwise you're really implying that old geocentrism.
Yes.
Which, to be fair, I mean, around that time of this model, is a lot of the predisposition, but it's also to say that we are always the center in the subjective sense. The Earth is the center of the universe in the sense that we look out from here.
Yes.
We are the center because this is where we are in our body.
Yes.
Anyway, has that crossed your mind, or is that
definitely. And there's actually, I'm trying to remember what the name of there's a type of astrology. I think it's called Uranian astrology or Uranian astrology that's actually takes you out of that Earth-centric orientation. And it's not something I've studied. And then another thing I came across fairly recently, even though it's an old book, is the Pleiadian agenda. which was written by Barbara Hand Clow. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
And so, she's an astrologer, and the book has a lot of astrology in it. I mean, it's mostly channeled information, but it mostly is interrelated with astrology. And it really kind of blew my mind wide open because I felt like it took me beyond that Earth-centric focus.
In that same conversation too, tangentially, when we were talking about how things can kind of spill out into different conversations, what I think is interesting reflection is also how understanding the symbols of the planets and the constellations is oftentimes your access point to ancient knowledge in the sense of alchemy or in the sense of astrotheology, which is one thing that I got prompted to press your way. Because when we first talked on our own, we were talking about the precession of the equinoxes and the influence on the collective psyche of humankind, and how the age seemingly has a imprint on what we do historically, right? So in that sense, how much digging, if at all, and swipe me off if not, but have you done in how astrology plays into religious and mythic lore, in creation stories, or in there's all sorts of conversation about Christian astrotheology, that Jesus represents the sun at the 33rd degree as it equals the horizon. These kinds of things. Has this been entertainable to you, or is this outside of that practical range, like you were talking about before, where you just like to apply it? Or
I mainly like to apply it, and I think that's because of my background as a psychotherapist. I'm very my fascination, my passion is about helping individuals move through their life, with more grace and ease and consciousness. And so those kinds of studies haven't really been something that's really called me. And it's interesting that you're asking me this question, because fairly recently, one of my clients was asking me a similar question about, my study of mythology. And I said, well, I really haven't been that interested in mythology. And she's like, yeah, but isn't that what astrology is? Like, all of this is related to,
all
Greek
related.
mythology.
Yeah.
And it was like, yes, I know that. And if that's an area of interest for you, great, go for it. But that hasn't been what's really called to me. And in fact, around that time when you and I first connected, and I can't remember exactly when that was, maybe around the beginning of this year. Anyway, several months ago was kind of the first time that I got really interested in how those different ages, like the age of Aquarius, the age of Aries, the age of Pisces, how it relates to mythology and history, actual history. That's actually a fairly recent area of interest of mine.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a real wormhole too, because especially if you want to talk about if we do have past lives, for instance, when were you could be a whole nother question. When were you? And also what was going on when you were? And that could obviously, it's like a chalkboard with a bunch of lines across it, that kind of, mentality. I have often been very interested in that. So something that you mentioned about Vedic astrology being or that you'd heard or dug into to some capacity, that it was good for deciding dates. So that is, in my mind, fascinating, because one of the first things I did on my channel was the history of astrology before the course even happened. I did that for actually a pagan sanctuary, and that was my presentation, and also at an academic conference. And that all started bubbling up from what we've seen in civilization, which astrology does predate civilization. To what degree we can't know exactly how sophisticated it was, but it started with omens. It started with saying, when will the Nile flood? Can we sow the crops? And that was the attention, to the gods. The gods, i.e. the stars, the planets, tell you when to do these things.
Yes.
And so I found it fascinating that, it would seem that Vedic astrology, because that's right in that area of the Fertile Crescent, in that peripheral, where that's what it was about. It was about omens. It was about saying when we should build the temple. However, that's macro, right? Because it's macro in the sense of like what we should do for society, politically, collectively. And then in time, in the Western, which it seems very befitting that your predisposition towards the Western, because that's when it became like the first claim that it could be internal, that it could be microcosmic, right? That we can apply omens to ourselves and our own self-development, and this growing idea of individuality and how we can, now in Western society, we seem very much, if astrology is a question, it seems very much more predisposed towards the individual, right? Like get readings for ourselves. And so asking about political movements and making stock portfolios, that's a thing, but it's not as much of a presence.
Yes.
Have you worked, so in this regard, micro, macro, right? Have you ever cared to apply it in a macro sense to follow, okay, this conjunction's coming up. Historically, this conjunction has meant this. Has that been in your wing whatsoever?
And the reason I'm laughing is because I just haven't really been that interested in history. I'm much more future oriented, and I don't mean that in the sense of being predictive. But like I do have a monthly newsletter, and it's free, and people can sign up for it on my website. And in that newsletter, I oftentimes will address, in terms of what's going on astrologically, I'll address both the collective and the personal. But in terms of my focus on the collective, it's usually more about, again, like soul level evolution. So what's going on for the soul level evolution of humanity, more so than like what's going to happen with the stock market. And in terms of the history, I mean, I realize it probably would be very valuable for me to be more interested in the history of like, okay, the last time this conjunction happened, what was going on historically. And one of the things that kind of highlighted that for me was that at some point in 2020, once the pandemic became, everybody knew about the pandemic was happening, in the beginning of 2020, in January 2020, my newsletter was all about how 2020 was going to be a year of huge, change and upheaval, but I didn't pinpoint it as being, a pandemic. And then I listened to another astrologer at some point, again, like I say, into 2020, when the pandemic presence was obvious. And she related it back to what was going on astrologically when there was that big pandemic in the Spanish flu, back in the 1917, I think, or 1918. Again, see, I'm not that historically oriented, but I was like, wow. So if I had been tracking it through history, what was going on astrologically in 2020, maybe I would have foreseen that it might be something like a pandemic. But no, I hadn't foreseen that.
The only two things that I ever followed up on, just for, if it's ever fun to go down the alleyway for anybody, but that was in 2020, it was the Star of Bethlehem, as I recall. And that was a conjunction that only happens once every, I think it's like 200 or so years. And if you tracked that back, it seemed to really play into how resonant it was with the changing of the age. How each time when it shows up, it kind of it moves to the next chapter archetypally to ensuing the age. And so the next time that the Star of Bethlehem will come, it's going to be pushing that last bit of the age Aquarius onto the collective psyche. But again, so I want to relate with you because, again, we in these conversations, and I'm sure what can be posed to you quite often, so we want to talk about the far past, we want to talk about the far future, right? You have this tool, and we want to talk about things that we will never experience. We want to talk about.
Yeah.
And I like your approach in the sense that, and it's not to say that, of course, like encouraging to always expand beyond and to find fascination, but this is where we are, right? And this is what we're going through. We have emotions, we have internal developments. That's all that's real. But then, of course, we here I come, as a patron or something. And then instead of talking about myself, I want to talk about, 26,000, what's going to be on in 26,000. I'm thinking about my great grandchild right now. And I think that's a fascinating predisposition or cultural leaning that we have towards the whole subject. Because one of the questions that I was getting is astrology's ability to be predictive. And so I'm going to take a stab at it, and then I want to open it up to you to critique me or to agree or what have you. So in my study, my leaning always was that I think it was it Pliny the Elder? It was one of these old Greek men, ancient, long gone. And he said that the stars incline, but they do not compel, in the sense that this is an equal share between fatalism and free will. So there's and this is always such a tricky conversation because we're diving into philosophy here and causality. It's to say that everything will go a certain way per se, but there's a fair room for details to deviate. Especially for the individual and potentially for society. So it seems like this is resonant with you in the sense that it's shared. Like this will be an influence, but what you do with it.
Yes, exactly. And the kind of little metaphorical story I often share with clients around this question about, are things predetermined or not, or what, how much free will do I have? Is I think of the way I use astrology as like a weather forecast. So if I were to say to you, tomorrow it's going to be like pouring rain, lightning, thunder all day long, you can still choose that you want to go kayaking in an electrical storm tomorrow. You have that free will. But it is going to be an electrical storm and torrential downpour. So, I'm letting you know the forecast of the energies, and then you have your free will about what you're going to do or the choices you're going to make within those energies that are happening.
It's almost to say on the personal level too, like here are things that you will go through emotionally, circumstantially, right? But there's also this degree of, gosh, it's so tricky. Your patience will be tested, but you have the capacity of how to react exactly about that. Yes. It's very tricky because it's to say like, these are attributes at this time that won't be within your control. But you also have these attributes that will be within your control. So it's almost like this ever-moving, shifting wheel between what is controlled and what isn't in control to individual or to society at that specific junction. And it's always changing those aspects.
And another factor that I think is so important is, and again, I think this will be true both individually and on the collective level, is where is that individual or where is that collective of humanity, where are they at in terms of their consciousness level? So if we're not very conscious, we tend to just act out of our past conditioning and the past patterning, whether those are old patterns that come from, previous lifetimes or wherever they come from. I think that, on the collective level, humanity is so entrenched in a fear-based consciousness. So if we're just functioning out of old unconscious fear-based patterns, we're more likely to just continue to perpetuate those things into the future. And someone who's more conscious, or a group of people who's more conscious, and more making choices out of love rather than fear, then those outcomes or the experiences they'll have under whatever given weather conditions, astrological energies, will be interacting with their own consciousness. And I think a lot of times, or maybe I shouldn't say a lot of times, I'll say sometimes psychics or intuitives will predict someone's future, but they're actually reading the person's past. Mm. And a lot of times people do just keep recreating their past. And so they can think, oh, well, that intuitive person I went to was so correct because, this shit happened to me. But I think that it's important to not just be reading the past.
Mm-hmm. One other thing I need to acknowledge here is about the credibility of the tool. Mm-hmm. In the sense of what went wrong with its cultural approach, right? Like, and this was part of the history as well, but tracking how much of a priority it was for human society for so long, astrology, mm-hmm. I mean. Mm-hmm. And then the scientific revolution, Christianity, mm-hmm. the burning times, and this dissolve from even just science hand alone of calling it pseudoscientific, mm-hmm. And that being mostly interpreted as a damning subject, mm-hmm. as if anything that's not science mm-hmm. is not okay. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying? Like,
yes. Mm-hmm.
And to say that this is a tool that's approaching life, reality, archetypes differently mm-hmm. than the model that we've created, and how it might be of curiosity to you to see how in your lifetime, especially since 2003, mm-hmm. how the conversation has becoming rekindled mm-hmm. to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. And if you have ever had to I imagine you've had to kind of fight at times with the old contention about the subject. So I'd love to hear you muse a bit about that.
Well, one of the things I think is so interesting about my own kind of having to grapple with other people's skepticism or criticisms of astrology being, too woo-woo, is that when I was newer to astrology and, newer to practicing astrology, I encountered more kind of pushback from people. And the more I've just kind of relaxed into my comfort with it, my confidence in how powerful it is in terms of its applicability, I don't really encounter those kinds of contentious conversations anymore. Mm-hmm. So again, like sort of the interaction of like my consciousness with
law of attraction,
the inner and the outer, the law of attraction. Mm-hmm. And at a certain point, maybe about, I don't know if it was 1 or 2 years into my own practice of, integrating astrology in with my work as a psychotherapist, I made this conscious decision that I didn't want to work with people who were going to be contentious about it. Like, well, okay, then don't, there's a lot of other people you can work with, you don't have to come here and fight with me about, is this, accurate or valid? And the other thing is that initially I used to have a lot of people who'd come to me and they wanted me to give them a prediction. Yep. They'd want me to tell them what's going to happen to them. And so, like I say, 1 or 2 years into my process, I made this very conscious choice that I didn't want to work with clients who were wanting to use it in that way. And once I made that inner shift, I no longer magnetized people who were struggling with it or wanting to use it that way.
Your own journey in like understanding how to work with this and to represent this part. Like I brought it up before in the course, I think, but I when I was being a palmist, I was doing palmistry for people. at first I started getting these types where it's not that they wanted to contend with me about what I was doing, because then we had to get into a philosophical debate. And also the question is like, I'm not saying this is all real wholesale. I'm saying this is the method. I take the same approach. I'm like, this is what we've inherited of how it's done. And we can believe it or we can throw it out the window. You know, I'm not, do you think I'm wearing like regalia right now? You know, you think I'm the priest class? But in the palms, you know, there's this predisposition, like in astrology, where people think that you can wholesale tell them what will be, as if you have like ascended, become the bodhisattva himself, seen the framework of the inner dwellings of the universe, which is insane. But I had a lady who was insistent that I tell her if she was going to die young. Like, look at my hands, you know, look. Will I? She had this fervent fear, paranoia that was eating away at her, because I believe that it was what she experienced with her mother when she was young. And so she was afraid that now that she had children, and so this fear had consumed her, as if this was karmic, and as if some rando person that she just met, could tell her and offer her the security of this issue. And of course I couldn't, but I found it not disturbing, but it really hit me quite sharply that I could be handed the podium of this authority for what I was doing, and how I'd have to dismiss that, or how I could try to become understood in where I am, you know, and representing this post. So I just wanted to relate with you about that, because it seems like if it's an unknown discipline in society, and society can't answer the questions that somebody's looking for, the only place they can go is to the fringes. And since these are disciplines on the fringes, it's the last stop for these questions. So I think that's fascinating too, because really we just want answers. And we can't find them.
And I also think that in terms of like predicting the future, that we don't know, like especially like the long-term future, like you said, you know, the year 26,000. You know, what's going to be happening with humanity if we're still existing on the earth in 26,000? What'll be happening with the collective consciousness in 26,000 would depend a lot on what happens in all these intervening years. You know, so it's not just like there's some, again, like I don't believe in 100% that things are just predestined and it's just all going to happen. It's contingent on so many factors, I think. And then even I have had people also ask me, you know, like, can you tell me when I'm going to die? I've had younger people ask me, I've had elderly people ask me. And I always say, you know, I can't predict that. And even if I could predict it, I wouldn't feel ethical to do that. And one thing I heard fairly recently that really resonates is true for me, though there's no way I can say that this is absolutely true, but it just makes sense to me intuitively that astrologically speaking, that there's actually several possible exit points. Like there's not just one predetermined point of death, but there's different kinds of, you know, sort of constellations of energies under which a person could leave their body. But they're not necessarily going to take that exit at that time. So another reason why not to like pretend that we could be sure of when somebody's going to die.
It's also true in palmistry, in the sense that here's a conjunction around this time of your life where something could happen. But here's the thing that always switches things up. So you think the hand is like a map, right? And so it's like, all right, dead set. These are the times, but it's not always going to have a conjunction where it's going to show you that it's trepidatious in the hand. So the fact of even that being present is not 100%. But here's the other twist in, is that the lines change with consciousness. And what I mean is that if you change your character consciously, it changes the lines. It changes the trajectory of how things will go from that point forward. So I always have to say, if you change nothing about yourself ever again, and you remain the same person as you are now, then here's a potential time, and here's a potential time that will be disastrous, but that's it. But if you change anything, anything at all about yourself, then it's a whole different story, which I think is a curious twist around when it comes to this whole thing, because that's manifestation, that's law of attraction, that's like, okay, this character that you are now, this is your future, right? But is that to say that this is the character that you will always be?
Yes. And that's kind of what I meant also when I was saying about, like, are you going to forecast or predict a future based on the past patterning? It's like, if the person never changes and they don't become more conscious and they're not working through their issues, then it probably is pretty likely that they're going to recreate their past or just keep the same pattern going and going into the future. But if they do change, like you're saying, if they go through a change, then the outcome or how things are going to unfold into a future will also change.
And I think this also like shines an interesting light on the nature of our previous discussion on, say, like prophecy, how much credo we can give to prophecy. So society is this way, and society has these deficiencies. And so if society doesn't do anything about society, then clearly, if just as an example, if this person is a drunkard, and they keep being a drunkard and driving around, then it would seem that they might get a DWI and something might go really bad. So like that's like intuitive, right? Like it's obvious. X plus B equals, yada, yada, right? And so in that sense, the nature of prophecy is to say that, like, if things stay this way, then, and it's, and I think there's a possibility of, say, like, meditating on that and really trying to savor every single kind of taste and like taking inner space for like what that might look like and how that all plays out. Then you can do some Nostradamus vibes or something. But beyond that, the nature of prophecy is contingent on one equation playing out. But of course, religiously speaking, revelations, people love or have been indoctrinated by the idea that things can be so dead set. I think that also plays into the credo that we were trying to hit at earlier when it comes to, like, you need to tell me this, because they've inherited a story, a mythos from Christianity that tells them that things can be said about what will be. I don't know. Have you, okay, so I think I have like two more, and then I think we have plenty.
Okay.
But I guess if you've ever had any nuanced conversations or battles with like the contemporary culture, in the sense of like the approach of Christianity was always an issue in certain times that I would provide tarot or, say, palm. Because people would assume that what I was doing was conjuring spirits.
The devil?
Yeah, something to that effect, right? Insert blaspheme here. And I'm wondering, like, I can imagine that at certain points you've worked with certain clients that have like some insecurities about like the subject, or maybe like wanted to open up a dialogue about how to rationalize their Christian, or their even like not just Christian, but even like the very regular approach of a standard Westerner that's, predisposed towards materialism and nihilism, this insecurity about like actually breaking bread about this whole conversation. Have you seen that deliberation?
I have kind of a funny story that I like to tell. You can decide if you want to share this story or not.
I love stories.
So really, with most of my clients, I mean, if they're coming to me because they're open to this modality. But I lived for a few years in Asheville, North Carolina. And when I first moved there, I didn't have any clients. And so I put an ad in the local newspaper and thinking, Asheville, North Carolina, if anybody knows about Asheville, it has the reputation of being, very progressive, even though it's in the South. Well, it is still in the South. It's still the Bible Belt. And so not long after I started advertising in the local paper, one day in my mailbox, there's this package with a DVD inside and no return address. And so I pop in the DVD, and it's this dramatized story of this man who his life was great, he's married and kids and has a great job in the house and life's perfect, right? And then he gets into the occult and his whole life goes to hell. It's like he loses his wife and the kids and he becomes a drunkard, and just his whole life, goes terrible. And then, but then he gets saved, and, he leaves behind the occult. So it's like, I still, have no idea who sent me that DVD, but my guess is somebody who saw my ad in the paper, and they're like, here's this woman, she's doing astrology, she's doing the work of the devil.
We need to save her.
But that's really that was my only encounter, but it was pretty kind of dramatic. And it was kind of scary because I was like, wow, like there's eyeballs on me. There's people watching me and what I'm doing and judging what I'm doing. And I had moved to Asheville from Colorado, where there wasn't that kind of vibe at all. And so it was really kind of shocking and a little bit scary to me to feel like people were thinking I was doing the devil's work.
It might be worthy for you to know, but when I was doing all that research for the history of astrology and the conference and whatnot, I had to dig. What made that possible is I did an independent study on the history of female philosophers, strangely enough. So I had to dig into Hypatia of Alexandria, and I had to dig into astrology to understand Hypatia. And that is to say that I had to contrast what the Bible said during this time, what the scriptures were saying during this time, and what was going on in the intellectual climate of Alexandria, which is where we got the birth of Vedic, or the confluence of all these astrologies that would ultimately become the Western canon of astrology. So I had to kind of dig in. And so why was there a trouble with Christianity and astrology? And really, it's one of the most convoluted stories you can ever imagine, because there's so many instances within the Bible where things are astrological, very clearly astrological. They're paying a lot of attention, and they're saying like, this is what it is, and this is good, and this is how it works. And then all of a sudden they're like, in Leviticus, or like, damn the monthly prognosticators, the diviners, that they should try to like, basically it's all up to God. You can't look into the future, which is my say, and this is where I'm going into details endlessly, but it is to say that they did not like its affiliation with pagan idolatry, because you're talking about the signs, you're talking about Aries, you're talking about, Uranus, you're talking about Jupiter, right? These are idolatry. And so they wanted to politically remove all conversation about anything other than God. So it was convenient for them to oust astrology to maintain the power structure that they were trying to build. Because it wasn't as necessitated in their canon as it was in others. They could sacrifice it without a compromise in Christianity. And that's that. And so this blood feud goes back to a political feud for the dominance of power roughly 2,000 years ago. And people are keeping it up. They're like... They don't even know what they're keeping up. And it's like in Romeo and Juliet kind of thing. The battle between these families, they don't even know where it began. They just know that they have to do it. So I thought that might be of some use, at least in contextualizing it. It's very
interesting.
Yeah, because it seems so confounding to me. Like, why? Why? Nobody's going to ask why? Which that whole movement, and there is a substantial movement if you look up certain subjects like on the internet, YouTube, whatever, certain religious, spiritual studies that I've had to do, you'll just find a litany. Like if you look up things on Gnosticism, you'll find a litany of such films like the one that was sent to you, where it's the story of diving into the occult and being saved by Jesus at the Deus Ex Machina moment. And, you know, this is not new. This is strangely not new. But anyway, so on a lighter tone.
Yes.
So what one of my last closing things is I wanted to ask about the nature of those who come to you for coaching, and maybe just as a practitioner, maybe just certain themes that you've seen when it comes to what post you operate on or what position individuals are in when, you know, they come to you, what like certainties that you've been able to help provide, and also any stories of when this has gone like very synchronistic, you know, when something very strange has happened as a, you know, which I'm sure you have plenty of. I know I've experienced a few, but you've had far more years than I. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about, one, the nature of your position and the audience that comes to you, and two, any kind of seemingly more miraculous or kismet inducing occasions that have come from this.
Well, I have one from this morning, from a client this morning, you know, without giving any, you know, away any confidential information. And most of my clients come to me on their own, meaning that it's not a gift certificate. You know, they've on their own decided they were seeking my counsel. And so in those situations, you know, oftentimes the person is grappling with some kind of challenge in their life and they're looking for more understanding of it and how to work with it. This client I had this morning, she came through a gift certificate. So it wasn't of her own that she was reaching out and wanting help, just kind of a friend of hers gave it to her for her birthday, not because anything in particular was going on. And because it was my first time working with her, the way I work with people the first time is that we spend quite a bit of time exploring what are their basic soul, not basic, but their primary soul lessons, and what can they do to kind of further their evolutionary journey in this lifetime. And so that's, you know, the approach I was taking with her. And I'm talking about kind of these big picture soul level themes that are, you know, important in her life in general. And then she just happened to relate it to something that just happened, you know, this weekend that she's been grappling with. So to make it a little bit more specific, but again, without, you know, giving away personal information. So the theme, one of the soul level themes for her is that her soul is very familiar with having a lot of crises and traumas and drama and change. Like, you know, there's always like, when's the next thing going to happen? And one of the phrases I used for that was this feel like living with a feeling of like, when's the other shoe going to drop? And then she shared with me that she had just come off of a weekend where everything was like, you know, she was in a new exploring a new relationship and they had a great time together. And then at the end of the weekend, just one little thing kind of triggered her off into a feeling of like, oh, okay, everything's okay now, but when's the other shoe going to drop?
Yeah.
And so like, it was a big like light bulb moment for her to be able to put that very recent, very real experience into this bigger context of like, okay, that wasn't just kind of a random thing that happened for you this past weekend. Or it's not even just a random pattern that it happens in your life. It's like, this is a major soul level thing that you're here to work through. And the actual message that I really wanted her to get about her soul's evolutionary journey is that she's not here to continually to repeat that pattern of crisis, trauma, and when's the other shoe going to drop, but actually her soul purpose and process is about living into a sense of like that things are stable and comfortable and peaceful and secure, and that like everything's going to be okay. And you don't have to wait for when's the other shoe going to drop. So that was a very synchronous thing that just happened today.
It seems like it's facilitating an environment that will provide like realization and synchronicity and coincidence, because you're dealing with noticing personal pattern, right? Like you're pointing out.
Yes.
So, and of course it's going to touch somebody, because that's the whole idea.
Yeah.